Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the February 2026 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Fuhrmann. I'm the Deputy Director of NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. Our other speakers today, we have Elliot Wickham from NIDIS, who will be stepping in for Shelby Saxon today to give us a water resources update. We also have Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. And joining us today, we're pleased to have Karin Gleason from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, who will be giving us a recap of the weather and climate in the Southeast from 2025. So again, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder to type your questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in the next day or so. So, all right, let's get started with an overview of the climate. Slide. All right. So mean temperatures regionally have been quite a bit below average, especially across the northern tier of the region. In a lot of places up there, we're talking more than 5 degrees below average. We also saw below average temperatures across much of the Florida peninsula. If we zoom out a bit and look at the winter season to date, the pattern is similar, but a little more mixed. The northern tier of the region still running below average, while much of the rest of the Southeast is a bit closer to average overall. And across Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, temperatures have actually been mostly above average for the past few months. Okay, next slide. So some of the coldest temperatures of the season occurred from late January into early February, specifically from January 25th through February 7th. That period ranks as one of the coldest on record at several long-term stations across Virginia, the Carolinas, and also parts of northern Georgia. What's really remarkable is just how cold it got across such a large area. The northern half of the region saw minimum temperatures drop into the single digits. Even the higher elevations of the Appalachians fell below zero. Meanwhile, across much of the southern tier of the region, temperatures dropped into the 20s, and we even saw sub-freezing temperatures all the way into southern Florida. Orlando, for instance, dropped to just 24 degrees on the morning of February 1st. Okay, next slide. There you go. Okay, so switching gears to precipitation, the big headline here is that it's been exceptionally dry across much of the region, not just this winter, but going all the way back to late summer. In fact, for several major cities like Raleigh, Charlotte, Atlanta, and even Columbus, Georgia, this has been the driest such period on record. And many more locations are ranking this stretch as one of their top 5 driest periods historically. So this isn't just a minor dry spell that we have here. This is something that really stands out in the long-term record. At the same time, we see almost the opposite story in the Caribbean. There, it's been quite wet, with many locations running several inches above average, especially over the past month. Okay, next slide. Now, that lack of rainfall has had very real impacts, and you can see it clearly here on the drought monitor. Dryness and drought coverage started to increase sharply in late summer and early fall, as you see there on the left. By early January, nearly 100% of the Southeast DEWS region was in either drought or abnormal dryness. That's the highest percentage in the history of the drought monitor, which started, at least regionally, back in January of 2000. That broke the previous record from August 2007. The coverage of moderate drought and greater also came within about 1% of the all-time record coverage set during that drought from 2007-2008. And just last week, the coverage of severe drought, D2 and greater, nearly reached 60%, which is, again, the highest we've seen since that really severe drought back in 2007 and 2008. Okay, next slide. Okay, when we look at the Caribbean, though, the picture's pretty different. Thanks to above average rainfall, dryness has been eliminated across much of Puerto Rico, though a few pockets there are still hanging on. And some D0 is also persisting on St. Thomas as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, so another big story, perhaps one of the biggest stories recently, has been winter weather, with multiple storms affecting the region over the past month or so. The first major event was the winter storm from January 24th to 26th, which brought snow, sleet, and freezing rain across a large part of the region, in fact, a large portion of the southern U.S. Across the Piedmont and Blue Ridge of Virginia, many places saw 4 to 6 inches of snow and sleet, with some higher elevation and far northern locations picking up as much as 10 inches. Further south and east, 1 to 3 inches fell. from eastern Virginia through central North Carolina and into the southern Appalachians. Northern Alabama and Georgia picked up about an inch, while parts of South Carolina saw mostly trace amounts. But the real story from the storm, and what's being shown here on the slide, in many places was the ice. Between a quarter and half an inch of freezing rain fell across parts of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and into North Carolina, as well as parts of Virginia. And in Tennessee, in particular, some areas recorded over half an inch of ice, including Nashville, which experienced its worst ice storm in decades. We saw over 250,000 power outages, and unfortunately, at least 29 people lost their lives during this storm. Okay, next slide. Okay, just a few days later, the region was hit again by another major winter storm. We saw measurable snow stretching from eastern Georgia through the Carolinas and into southern Virginia. There were even flurries reported as far south as Tampa. In North Carolina, this storm was especially significant. According to the North Carolina State Climate Office, it was the first time since 2014 that all 100 counties reported measurable snow, and it was the first time since 1980 that every observation was at least 1 inch. In the mountains, most places saw 6 to 12 inches, with some spots getting over a foot, including Beech Mountain. Parts of western Virginia also picked up about 6 inches. Head a little further south across central North Carolina, especially as we look along the I-85 corridor, several locations recorded almost a foot of snow. The highest amounts were in Kannapolis and Lexington. They topped out at around 16 inches. We head even further south. Parts of the upstate of South Carolina saw over 6 inches. And if we go even further south into Athens, they picked up about 4 inches of snow there. But maybe the most remarkable part of the storm was actually in eastern portions of North Carolina. For many locations there, this was the biggest snowstorm in over 40 years. You had places like Greenville, Kinston, New Bern getting over 10 inches. Saw parts of the Outer Banks in southeastern North Carolina seeing at least 15 inches of snow. To put that in perspective, at that time, those totals actually exceeded the season-to-date snowfall in places like Bismarck, Denver, even Salt Lake City. Okay, so really remarkable. And we even saw blizzard conditions if you combine the snow with the wind, very strong wind gusts, 50 plus miles an hour and low visibility. We saw blizzard conditions across the Outer Banks during the storm as well. And the snow didn't stop there. If you head a little further south down towards Myrtle Beach, they got about 8 inches of snow. Charleston, South Carolina came in at just under an inch. And if you head even further south to Savannah, they recorded about half an inch of snow. And that's actually only the second time on record that Savannah has had measurable snow now in back-to-back seasons. They had snow last season, they had it again this season. Only the second time that's happened since records began there all the way back in 1871. Okay, next slide. Okay, so looking ahead, in terms of ENSO, we're still currently in a La Niña advisory, but conditions are expected to transition to neutral over the next few months and will likely stay neutral through the summer. Now, looking a bit farther out, you can see the odds of an El Nino developing do start to increase later in the year. That said, as many of you know, we are approaching what's known as the spring predictability barrier. This is the time of year when ENSO forecasts are less reliable, so we'll have to wait until we get past that point, probably later this summer and into fall, before putting too much confidence in any specific long-term ENSO forecast. Okay, next slide. So looking at the 3-month outlook from CPC, we see above average temperatures across the region heading into spring, with equal chances of above and below average precipitation across much of the region, except if we look in parts of northwestern Tennessee, they're leaning a bit above average for the spring. Okay, next slide. In the Caribbean, we see that the outlooks are advertising above average temperatures, but near average precipitation for the next few months. Okay, next slide. If we look at the 3-month drought outlook, we see that drought is expected, unfortunately, to persist across the southeast, except across parts of far western Tennessee, where drought may be eliminated in the coming months. And the Caribbean is expected to remain drought-free over the next several months as it enters its wet season. Okay, next slide. All right, so short term, looking out to next week, temperatures expected to be above average across much of the region, while interior and northern parts of the southeast, as well as parts of South Florida, are leaning wetter than average in terms of precipitation. If we go to the next slide, we'll see looking at the 8 to 14 day outlook, so looking late next week into next weekend, we basically see a continuation of this pattern. So let's go ahead and look at the 3 to 4 week outlook on the next slide. And so as we get into mid-March, we see above average temperatures continue to be projected across the region, with above average precipitation across maybe the far western portion of the southeast, with below average precipitation forecasted across much of the rest of the region. Okay, should see the summary on the next slide. So there's the summary for you to look over after the webinar. Of course, want to acknowledge our service climatologist, William Schmitz, who as always does a great job putting all this material together. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elliot for our water resources update.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody. My name's Elliot. I'm the Southeast Dues Coordinator for NOAA. I am not with the Southeast River Forecast Center. I'm just covering for them. They are on shift later this afternoon, so much appreciated that they sent their slides for us to cover this. Go ahead, Eleanor, next line. So as you can see here with the 28-day average stream flows, most of the Southeast is in the below or well below normal conditions for the Southeast. And this is presented here on the hydrograph for the area for the South Atlantic Gulf region, with the black line showing our conditions for the 28-day average, showing that we are in much below normal conditions, below the 5th percentile line there. Next slide. As we break this down state by state, we can see that below normal conditions persist at a state level. Alabama is probably faring the best right now, at least on this slide, with that current conditions hovering right at there between the below and well below conditions. And then Georgia is towards the much below normal conditions there, well below the 5th percentile line, that yellow line going through the red zone there. And then Florida is actually in new record low territory. It is literally off the charts for average stream flow at the 28-day for the state. Next slide. And then for North Carolina, they're also in the below or well below normal conditions there. Or excuse me, South Carolina and North Carolina both well below normal. South Carolina faring a tad better, above the 5th percentile, while North Carolina is below the 5th percentile. And then Virginia is more at that borderline between the much below and the below normal conditions there. And so we can see that across the 7 states here, or 6 states, excuse me, that the conditions are stream flow conditions are well below normal. Next slide. So for given that everything is dry across the region, it's not shocking that all rivers are below flood level currently in the green section there. And the next slide. So for the southeast area, excluding Florida, we are in peak flood season climatologically. You wouldn't know that based on the stream flows now, given how low they are, but this further highlights the unusualness of the dryness and the inactivity that we're seeing in our streams right now. And then on the next slide, for the South Florida area, we are in a normally drier period for Florida right now, but even so, the dryness that we are currently seeing is well below normal, as evidenced in the stream flow graphic and the drought status across the state. And the next slide. So the region is in the, for the spring outlook, March through May, we're in normal risk of flooding. And that's basically due to the fact of how dry conditions are, the forecast for the rainfall over the next month or so, and what that will do for river conditions. So there's no elevated risk for flooding at the moment. And then the next slide with the water summary, I think the biggest takeaway is if you go back and watch this webinar and you look at where we're at in the current conditions, much below normal for most states, or that teeter between below normal and much below normal. If you look at that hydrograph, we're in that point of the year, except for Florida, where all those hydrographs are increasing, meaning that we should be gaining in stream flow. This is the time of year where we're supposed to be increasing in water resources. And while that trend line is going up, it's still staying in the well below or below normal conditions. So we're seeing an increase in river flow, but it's not getting us out of the below normal conditions. So that's something to watch as we go forward into the spring. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Pam for the agricultural conditions.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be back. A lot has happened over the last few months. Let's jump right in. Go ahead, and I've got a summary, sort of a list of some of the recent impacts. I didn't even really talk about last fall because that's been a while, but of course, fall it was dry, had problems getting winter grains and pastures established. A lot of farmers have been feeding hay to their livestock for most of the winter or culling their herds. That dry conditions are really going to continue to be worrisome, even more so because a lot of plants now are coming out of dormancy. I notice at our house some of the plums are blooming, and my honeysuckle has leaves on it now. So water use by plants is going to really ramp up once they come out of dormancy, and that's going to really draw down the soil moisture even more. So that's really a concern. The cold outbreaks we've had this winter, everybody asked me about how cold it's been over the winter. It really hasn't been all that cold, except it's been up and down and up and down and up and down. And so we have these really cold spells, as we did this morning, where the entire state of Georgia, I know, was below freezing around sunrise this morning. And so we've had a lot of chill hours, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we have also had these really warm spells where Athens was up to almost 80 at least once. So the plants have finally come out of dormancy with that. I know that some of the blueberry producers have called me to ask about using water for freeze protection because there isn't a lot of it right now, and that's been a real concern. They don't want to use more than they have to because they might need it later. One of the most notable things about this winter has been the freeze in January that Chris mentioned has been estimated to result in $3.17 billion in losses to Florida agriculture. And I've got a couple slides on that as well. One of the most damaging losses ever for them. And they probably had more damage this morning because of the frost, and we'll talk about that. One of Georgia's key crops, Vidalia onions, did have some frosted freeze damage to the foliage, which cuts down on growth. But it does seem to be that it's growing out of it. So hopefully we'll have Vidalia onions this year. And the lack of, as I mentioned, the lack of precipitation through winter caused the problems with forage and winter grains. So let's go and jump ahead to the next slide. Thank you, Eleanor. Soil temperatures on the left-hand side show that most of the southwestern part of the region has soil temperatures above normal. Farmers watch that to know when it's time to start planting. Something like corn can grow in when the soil temperature is about 50. Some other things like cotton and peanuts go in when the soil temperature is more like 65, just depending on the variety. And so a little early for the northeastern part of the region, but something that we're definitely watching. And as you would not be surprised to see, soil moisture across almost the entire region has been very dry in consideration with the drought that we've been having, with the exception of northern Alabama and eastern Tennessee, which have gotten more recent rain. So let's go ahead. The chilling hours for Fort Valley. If you use agroclimate, I noticed it was down for a while this weekend, but it does seem to be up now, which is great because it's a very useful tool. This shows the Fort Valley chilling hours for this winter season starting at the beginning of October. And you can see the total for this year is pretty similar to what it was last year. A lot lower than the long-term average because, of course, we're going through a warming period. If we go to the next slide, I put a summary here, table of the last few years for some of the blueberry areas in Georgia from the University of Georgia Weather Network. Last 2 years have been pretty similar for the October 1 through present time periods, but really a lot more chilling hours the last 2 years than there have been in some of the previous ones. So everything's ready to go as soon as it gets and stays warm. And if you're in a different state, there's some websites down at the bottom there that you can look to see if they have chilling hours. Not all of them do, but some of them do. Let's go on. And here's just an example of how cold it got in Florida. This is the number of hours below freezing. Of course, you know, if it just touches freezing and goes right back up, there's probably not going to be a lot of damage. But if it stays for a number of hours below freezing, as it did through a lot of the peninsula, that really causes a lot of damage. And here's the estimates to each of the different crops. Strawberries lost 80% of their acreage. Sugarcane lost part of it, 35% of this year's production, but also damage to the plants, which will cause future damage as well, which is included in that estimate. Blueberries, 90% of the acreage lost. That's in spite of them trying to, you know, irrigate to do frost protection. But when it gets down really cold, that's not very effective. And citrus also had a huge amount of loss, not only from current production, but also from, you know, death to the trees and damage to the trees as well. So if you want, you can go back and look at this in more detail. Let's go on. There's some pictures here of some of the frost damage on the next slide. Uh-oh, are we stuck? There we go. And this is just some examples of some of the damage to the crops in Florida, citrus and zucchini and blueberries. Sweet corn was just flattened, and the tomatoes as well. In the middle is a picture of them desperately trying to do frost protection using irrigation, even with the limited amount of water that they have. So let's go on and talk about freeze. You can see that the average date of the last freeze on the left hand, the bright green is this week, the end of February. And you can see we're right about at the average date of the last freeze for southern Alabama and southern Georgia and the northern part of Florida. But 1 in 10 years, it can happen all the way down into the peninsula of Florida. And so we're not out of the woods yet as far as the freeze goes. If you look on the next slide, since I put these slides together this weekend, this was the predicted temperatures for this morning. And you can see that the freezing temperatures went well down into the Florida peninsula. I haven't had a chance to look at Florida, but I know everywhere in Georgia was below freezing this morning. And so it seemed like it was a pretty good forecast. Some of the areas right along the coast, some of our barrier island stations are above freezing now, and that will slowly change over the day because we're going to get plenty of sunshine and warmer air moving into the area. So we're right on track for the normal. Here's the map that shows the latest frost dates since 1991. And you can actually go in and look at your area and see what was the latest that ever happened. There are some places that had latest frost in April. You might remember the Easter frost a number of years ago in Georgia, which was really devastating. So we do know that we're in a weak La Niña now, likely to go into neutral. Dave Zierden has told me that neutral ENSO years are more likely to have late freezes. And so I don't think we're out of the woods yet as far as freezes go. We'll just have to watch. Some places in the south are not too likely to get it, but this year has been really up and down, so we'll see. If we go on, this is my summary. You can read through it at your leisure. And now it's my privilege to introduce Karin Gleason, who's going to talk about the 2025 year in review. So take it away, Karin.
Thank you, Pam, and thanks for the invitation again this year. I will be covering some of the highlights, certainly from my perspective, but also from some of our monthly climate reports where we summarize conditions across the entire country and the globe. I'll try to focus as much as I can on the Southeast region. So let's begin on the next slide. So as you may already know, the the U.S. had its fourth warmest year on record during 2025 with a long-term anomaly, or the anomaly from the long-term mean being 2.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And parts of the western U.S. and the south had record and near record temperatures for the year. But looking in the southeast, we see the year was warmer to much warmer than average across most of that region. All right, next slide. We'll zoom in a little closer here into the southeast, and we see that the region was cooler than the previous 2 years, but still above the long-term mean. Both Florida and Tennessee had their 11th warmest year on record, with all of the other southeast states having an above average year. The map on the right is a county level map. You'll see quite a few of these in my presentation, so it kind of gives you an idea of where in the distribution each county fell. So salmon colors, light colors, are in the upper third of the distribution, so above average temperatures. The darker orange color would be much above average, so in the top 10%, so about 13 out of 131 years. And a super bright red, which you see in the left part of that right-hand graphic, is a record warmest year for that location. And similarly on the cold side, we do have some cold temperatures to talk about, so it's not all going to be warm. All right, next slide. All right, so we're going to break this down season by season, and we see that on a whole, the winter season was near average across the region. December 2024 was warmer than average for North Carolina and Tennessee, and near average for the other southeastern states. January, we see, was cold with all southeastern states, ranking between their 14th and 20th coldest such January on record. Many counties across Appalachia and eastern Alabama, southern Georgia, northern Florida, and parts of coastal North Carolina had a January that was one of the 13 coldest on record. Looking at February, we saw a rebound in temperatures and ranked warmer than average, with Florida 7th warmest, Georgia 12th warmest, and South Carolina 13th warmest. Next slide, please. Moving on to spring, we see it was third warmest on record for the region as a whole, with parts of eastern North Carolina ranking warmest on record. You can see that with the dark red shades in those counties. March was 9th warmest for Virginia, with an above average month in Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Florida ranked near average during March. April as a whole was second warmest across the region, with North Carolina and Virginia ranking also second warmest. South Carolina was third warmest, Florida 7th, and Georgia 5th warmest. Tennessee was 7th warmest, Alabama 10th warmest. So a lot of top 10 warmest for the month of April. May was more temperate across western and northern portions of the region, with Florida ranking second warmest for the month, and several areas that were actually record warm along the Atlantic coast there of Florida. All right, next slide. Moving on to summer, we see it was the 10th warmest on record for the southeast. Breaking this down by month, we see Virginia was 6th warmest for June, and North Carolina 13th warmest. In July, there was a lot of heat across the southeast, and it was record warm, with North Carolina 2nd warmest, Georgia, Virginia 3rd warmest, Florida and South Carolina were 4th warmest, and Tennessee 7th warmest. Alabama rounding out the top 10 with 10th warmest. August was remarkably cold compared to June and July, from Alabama to Virginia, with South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia ranking much colder than average, so the coldest 10% of observations. And in contrast, Florida ranked 6th warmest, with parts of the southern peninsula record warm. All right, next slide. All right, rounding out the seasons with fall, we saw it was warmer than average across the region by and large, with September and October resembling that fall average by and large, meaning warmer in the western portion of the region and near average to slightly below average along the Carolina coast. November was warmer than average across all states except Florida, which was near average. All right, let's move on to precipitation in the next slide. And we see overall it was a below average year, with certainly a mixed bag of wet and dry pockets. Much of the Southeast was drier on average on a whole, with Florida ranking 13th driest for the year. All right, next slide. Looking at precipitation across the region, we see it was the driest year since 2011. We see in the graphic on the right-hand side, Hernando and Citrus counties on the Gulf Coast of Florida had their driest year on record in 2025, contributing to the 13th driest year for the state. Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina were below average, with Alabama, Tennessee, and Virginia near average on the whole. Next slide. Now, breaking this precipitation down season by season, we see that for the winter, it was relatively dry across much of the region, especially the extreme southeast portions. In December of 24, we saw Florida was below average, with all other southeast states averaging near average conditions for precipitation. In January, North Carolina ranked 7th driest, with Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia also below average. Florida ended up near average for the month. February was wet, especially across the northern portion of the region. Virginia ranked 5th wettest. Tennessee was above average. Alabama and North Carolina were in the middle near average, with Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina ending the month below average. All right, next slide. Looking at the spring season, it was wetter than average for the region as a whole. March was drier than average across North and South Carolina and Virginia, and near average across Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. April was wet across Western Tennessee. We'll talk about this in detail from a slow-moving frontal system that caused flash flooding and severe weather early in the month. Overall, Tennessee ranked 12th wettest. The region was drier closer to the Atlantic coast and Florida, with Florida ranking 11th driest. The pattern changed dramatically in May and was 2nd wettest overall across the region. Alabama had its wettest May on record, with all states in the region besides Florida ranking among their wettest 10 on record for the month, with several counties in parts of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia actually having their wettest May on record. Next slide, please. All right, looking at summer, the beginning of summer continued to be wet, but it was a bit of a mixed bag overall across the Southeast. June was wetter across Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, near average across the other Southeastern states. July was dry across Alabama at 8th driest, and wet in Virginia with 5th wettest. August was dry across Tennessee and Virginia, and 13th wettest across Georgia. All right, turning our attention now to fall on the next slide. We see fall was dry, as you likely know, ranking 6th driest. Georgia was 4th driest, and Florida also 6th driest for the season as a whole. In September, Georgia ranked 3rd driest. You can see the large region of record dry across the southern portion of the state. South Carolina ranked 11th driest for the month. October then brought a pattern change with more moderate precipitation across the region. There was an absence of active weather then in November across the Southeast, with the region as a whole ranking 6th driest for the month. Parts of Florida and South Carolina were driest on record, leading to South Carolina ranking 2nd driest and Florida 3rd driest for the month. Georgia was 5th driest, with the remaining southeastern states drier than average on a whole for the month. All right, now next slide. I didn't want to leave December of 2025 out of the mix for temperature or precipitation, so I've included a snapshot for those 2 months. Dry conditions prevailed across all of Tennessee and a large portion of Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. Looking at temperatures, we saw that they were warmer than average across much of Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee, and closer to average in Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. All right, so let's now shift our attention to the next slide, and we look at the drought monitor over the course of the year. We see the time series of the spatial extent of drought throughout the year, showing the ebb and flow of the drought periods, and I'll try to highlight 4 of these periods in particular. So the year began with about 27% of the region in moderate to extreme drought, primarily across portions of central Tennessee, the coastal Carolinas, central Alabama, northern Florida. A dry winter helped to expand drought across the region, reaching an early year peak at about 48% on February 11th. You can see the map on the bottom left showing the most intense drought, extreme drought in central and eastern portions of Tennessee. Drought ebbed and flowed through the spring with an expansion of D3 extreme drought growing across portions of central and southern Florida, maxing out at about 4% of the region on May 6th. You can see it in the next map adjacent to the February 11th map. Then a wet May and June, as we saw, helped to erode drought, reaching its minimum of the year at just 2.5% of the region on July 15th. Dry conditions then ensued in the fall and contributed to a rapid expansion of drought across the region, with a peak in extreme to exceptional drought occurring on November 25th. And you can see the peak of 9% of the region in D3 and D4 drought there, centered in southern Alabama, southern Georgia, and the panhandle of Florida. All right, and then peak drought coverage continued to grow and reached a peak for the year at the last drought monitor that was issued for the year on December 30th, covering about 73% of the region in moderate to extreme drought. All right, next slide. Looking at the North Atlantic hurricane season, which for the Southeast was a bit of a relief by and large. We saw overall a near average season with 13 named storms, and in all there were 5 hurricanes, 4 of which were major, and three were actually Category 5 hurricanes. That would be Erin, Umberto, and Melissa. And those 3 Category 5 hurricanes during 2025 in one season, that is the second most on record for a year, that behind 2005 when there were 4 Cat 5s. Hurricane Melissa, pictured here, tied the 1935 Labor Day hurricane as the strongest landfalling hurricane on record, and it made landfall in Jamaica at peak intensity with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles an hour. It was the strongest tropical cyclone to form in any of the global basins during 2025, so the strongest hurricane of the year. And despite the near average activity and the high Category 5 counts in the Atlantic Basin, there were no U.S. landfalling hurricanes during 2025, which is a first since 2015. But despite having no U.S. hurricane landfalls, the U.S. did have a tropical storm, Chantal, that made landfall in South Carolina in July. So turning our attention to the next slide, we will see some of the tropical systems that did have impacts in the Southeast. In particular, as I said, Chantal made landfall near Litchfield Beach in South Carolina in early July. It brought strong winds, heavy rainfall, and even some tornado damage. We'll talk a little bit more about that storm in a second when we talk about floods. Hurricane Erin was the first Cat 5 of the season in the Atlantic, and it did bring strong storm surge and winds to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Umberto followed, causing heavy surf along the southeastern Atlantic coast. And then it was looking as if Hurricane Imelda was going to make a direct hit. If you recall the news, and it just all the models and all the forecasts were showing for a while, it looked like it was going to impact the southeast coast in September. But then there was an interaction between Imelda and Umberto, also known as the Fujiwara effect, and that helped change the trajectory of Imelda pretty significantly, and it abruptly moved east, and it was pulled out into open waters, sparing the coast perhaps from additional impacts. All right, next slide. Looking at tornadoes across the country in 2025. So overall, it was the 5th highest count on record, with a preliminary total count of 1,559. We did have our first EF5 tornado rated since 2013, and that occurred in Enderlin, North Dakota. For the year, the North Dakota as a whole saw an abundance of tornado activity, setting a pretty big record for counts for the year. But now zooming in on the Southeast, I mentioned a severe weather and flooding that occurred in early April. So from April 2nd to 7th, A slow-moving system brought widespread flooding and more than 150 tornadoes across parts of the South and Midwest. There were 24 fatalities associated with that episode. 2 tornadoes in particular caused injuries and fatalities in Tennessee from this system. So in Selmer, Tennessee, we saw an EF3 that injured 14 and was responsible for 5 fatalities. Interestingly, this was the second time in just 2 years that a deadly EF3 impacted this part of Tennessee. In Grand Junction, Tennessee, there was another EF3 that injured 3 individuals and caused 2 fatalities. And then from a separate system on October 27th, there was a water spout that formed off the coast near Mexico Beach, Florida. It came on shore and it injured 10 people. All right, next slide. I wanted to just kind of compare and contrast the 2025 tornadoes to the 4 other most recent years on record to just kind of look at some of the spatial patterns. And we see that the sort of the Southeast Atlantic coastal states experienced fewer tornado events during 2025. So from Florida all the way up the eastern coast, it seems as if those counts are down. This is likely in part due to the lack of landfalling tropical systems during the 2025 hurricane season, and just the absence of weather patterns that might also have spun up tornadoes. All right, next slide. We're going to turn our attention to snow, go from sort of warm weather events and extremes to snow. And looking across the Southeast, there were 2 events that seemed to stick out for the year. In particular, the first occurred in January. I'm sure many of you remember when there was an Arctic blast that surged into the Southeast and beyond the coast, and it brought precipitation with it. And in the form of snow and large amounts of snow. There was quite the footprint from coastal Texas all the way to the Outer Banks in coastal Virginia, with several Gulf Coast state communities experiencing an all-time record snowfall. You can see from the graphic on the far right. There was a wide swath of 6 to 12 inches that fell across parts of southern Alabama, Georgia, and the Florida Panhandle. And although it received a lot of attention, the snow itself was not the biggest impact on the Southeast from this event. As Pam mentioned earlier, cold is a problem when it dips far south or at the wrong time of year. And agriculture took a big hit with some locations across the Panhandle. Temperatures plunged into the teens, and some temperatures were as low as 11 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's kind of like the unsung damage that sometimes happens. Even though we saw many pictures of college students playing in the snow at universities along the Southeast coast, it was exciting for them, but it was not a good thing for the agriculture industry. All right, in November, the graphic, oh, hold on, back one more slide. Yes, in November, the picture on the left-hand side of the frame, we saw an early season snow event that resulted from an Arctic blast, and that brought Wilmington and Lumberton the earliest season snow on record. Weather systems like this aren't uncommon during midwinter, but are much more rare early in the cool season. In Lumberton, they had 0.1 inches of snow. That was the earliest measurable snow on record, beating the previous early snowfall that had occurred towards the end of November in 1950. In Wilmington, it was the earliest snow that had been observed since local weather records began in 1871. They have seen other trace amounts of snow recorded a few times in mid-November, but their earliest measurable snow occurred later in the month in 1879. So early season snows along the Carolina coast. All right, next slide now. A little look into the wildfire season across the Southeast. We typically expect to have some wildfires. Certainly the western part of the U.S., we expect more and larger fires, but we did have our fair share of some larger events across the Southeast. First, in March and extending into April, there were more than 30,000 acres were consumed by multiple fires across southern Appalachia. These were driven by dry conditions, strong winds, and it was exacerbated by the abundant supply of fuel from all of the downed trees that occurred during Hurricane Helene in 2024. Mandatory evacuations and states of emergency were declared while these events were ongoing. In August, if we look at southern Florida, Broward County had fires in the Everglades that was exacerbated by dry conditions, strong winds, and available fuels. And that burned about 48,000 acres. These fires impacted air quality across much of southern Florida during the month. All right, turning our attention to the next slide, I briefly mentioned some flash flooding. So a couple of events that I wanted to highlight for 2025 in the Southeast. The early April severe weather outbreak and flooding from the slow moving system. It seems like a rather ironic juxtaposition of severe weather where you want to take shelter and you want to go to the lowest level, preferably maybe into your basement, but then you have flash flooding. And so being at lower levels is not necessarily ideal. So it's like pick your poison for the impacts. But there were multiple days of rain that ensued with this slow moving system, with 2 to 4 Aprils worth of rain. So think about April, what you might receive for the whole month, and then experiencing 2 to 4 of those in just 4 days' time in parts of Western Tennessee. That's what occurred. And that translates to widespread areas of 1 in 200 year return intervals to 1 in 1,000 year return intervals. So significant amounts of rain in very short periods of time. And so flash flooding was a huge deal, in addition to there being lots of tornado warnings. And so it's just a pretty big mess for a while there. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, I mentioned Tropical Storm Chantal that made fall in South Carolina, and it brought heavy rainfall to both South Carolina and North Carolina. In central North Carolina, up to a foot of rain fell in just a couple of days in the early part of July, causing flash flooding. The Chantal stalled over the region, delivering, like I said, 8 to 12 inches of rain. The flooding led to multiple rescues and 3 fatalities in Chatham County. 7 river gauges reported flooding, including 2 at major flood stage. There's a graphic here of the Eno River near Huckleberry Springs. It crested at over 23 feet, exceeding its 1989 record by more than 8 feet, with over 350 square miles experiencing a 1 in 100 year flooding and isolated areas reaching 1 in 1,000 year levels. Several stations in Kokora's gauges recorded over 15 inches for the month. Chapel Hill had 16.41 inches, making it the second wettest month on record, and nearly half of that fell on the 6th from Tropical Storm Chantal. And with that, the next slide is a summary of the highlights from all of my slides covering all the different topics. So I want to thank you so much for your time today, and we'll turn it back to Eleanor or Chris or somebody, Elliot. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Karin. Yes, so go ahead. We have a few minutes available for questions. Thank you all for these wonderful presentations. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to put these presentations together and covering them and providing the conditions for the Southeast, both in terms of last year and how we got to where we're at now, specifically for drought. So go ahead and enter your questions if you have them in the Slido apps, the button at the bottom of your screen. While you guys are doing that, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared in the next few days. So be on the lookout for that. And then our next webinar will be Understanding NOAA's Monthly and Seasonal Climate Outlooks. And that will be the last Tuesday in March, again, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central. And after the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at Elliot Wickham or elliot.wickham@noaa.gov.
Elliot, I've received 4 questions, and I'd be happy to briefly answer those for other people who might be interested. Harold Peterson noted that Cuba got down to 32 degrees in one of those cold outbreaks. It's really astounding that the cold air got that low and went all the way across the Florida Strait to hit 32. So that was just a sign of how strong that outbreak was. We got a question about the observed droughts being expected due to the impact of La Niña. We certainly know that when we have a La Niña winter, we're more likely to have drought in the next year. So I keep watching to see what happens. I am certainly concerned about this year as well, especially early in the year before the tropics pick up, because it's already incredibly dry. And so anything that's going into the ground is going to have trouble germinating. Plants are going to really have a struggle to try to maintain. And if the dryness continues and we have a dry spell during something like corn pollination season, we could lose the whole crop in just a few weeks. So I'm really concerned about that. We had a question about the national map showing the latest frost dates for the U.S. That was from the Midwest Regional Climate Center's VIP program, which is vegetation something or another. They have just updated their website, and I don't think there's a current version. It would clearly probably need to be updated with the outbreaks we've had this winter. So I know where to get individual stations at their website. I just don't know how to get a map like that. And then a final question about concerns for fire weather in the southeast. With these dry conditions, it's very likely we're going to have problems with wildfires this spring. I see there's already some that are showing up around the southeast part of Georgia. I'm sure there's problems in Florida as well. So that's definitely something that's of concern this year with the dry conditions. So those are the questions that I've seen.
Yes, those are the questions. Oh, there are some more coming in, so let's see.
All right.
Let's see. Let's see. Some of these are more. I'll go with the question first. Let's see. So I'll go ahead and put that in the chat here. Give me a second, and then pull this up here. I'll read it to you, Pam. Do you have any resources or map sites for showing aquatic vegetation growth based on climate and weather trends from 2025? I'll let you handle that.
I have not. That's an interesting question. I think there's probably some people who work more in aquatic hydrology that might be able to answer that, but I don't know of any. If you do and send it to me, I will try to pass it on, but I don't know that information. Okay. And so couple comments here about strong weather and the hurricanes, and then statistics on the mango crop in Florida. I don't know if the timing of the crop was such that they were able to avoid the freeze, or if it's just not as big of a crop. But I'm sure that whatever was there was probably hit. It's just a question on timing, and I have not looked into that. You can go online and find the report on the entire freeze from Florida, and it probably mentions mangoes in there.
So we still have time for questions. I think while we wait for seeing if more come in, I think, and this is for anybody to weigh in on, but I think the part we're waiting on now is we're in except for maybe Florida, we're kind of in that dormancy period of things are impact numbers are low, water uptake is low at the moment, plants haven't bloomed yet. And so where we're at now with water and available water and soil moisture, what's going to happen when that starts uptaking, or water demands, both plant and human, especially if we don't see a pattern change here to regular beneficial rainfall.
Yeah, you can see the current state of where plants are dormant using the usanpn.org website, the National Phenological Network, and that is pretty consistent with what I'm seeing in my own backyard, where leaves are just now starting to come out of dormancy. So obviously, if you're farther to the north in the region, it's going to be a while yet. But for most areas in the southern half of Georgia and Alabama, for sure, most stuff is coming out of dormancy. I saw a report this morning from the extension folks in South Carolina that some places peaches are already blooming, and certainly blueberries are too. So we're coming out of dormancy fast, and that's going to make a difference for the surface water hydrology.
Yeah, and the other part too is while we've had some rain kind of come through over the last couple weeks, I know that there's maybe been some chatter about why aren't we seeing some improvements, and I think part of that is while the rainfall has been very much welcomed, when you look at the hydrographs for where we're at, both in terms of stream flows and then what that deeper soil moisture looks like, is we have quite the deficits
Yeah, it's kind of a
climate.
drop in a bucket, and it's been hot too, so there's been more evaporation.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I don't see any more questions coming in. I'll give it maybe one more minute, but while we do that, again, thank you to everyone for participating today. Thank you again to our speakers so much for this wonderful information. Big thank you again to Karin for our special topics, giving a review of 2025. And we look forward to seeing everybody in March for our next webinar. And hopefully by then we have a pattern flip to wetter, more regular rainfall. But stay tuned because we're not out of this yet. Even if we do move to that, it's still going to take some time, I think, to get out of the drought and dry conditions. We got one more here. One question is there a long-term trend towards drought in the southeast? I think long-term, not necessarily. I think we've seen a lot more of these flash droughts that have kind of popped up over the last couple of years, or like fall droughts that have happened over the last couple of years. I think what makes this one different is the fact of we didn't get the recharge that we usually do during December and into January and February. It continued to stay dry or below normal. And so we had a continuation. And so I guess I'll say it's been a while since we've had a longer term drought. This one's a little bit different because I would say we've entered the longer term drought with the hydro and the deeper soil moisture. It's just when it transitioned into that component, it's been during a time when the impacts have not been, it's during a time of the year where impacts are pretty low. So hopefully, like I said earlier, we transition out of that and we move into better conditions, but more droughts. I think we've just kind of been in a pattern where we've been missing out. The fall is kind of a feast or famine situation for the southeast. If you don't get the hurricanes or the tropical systems that come through, then you don't get usually a lot of rainfall, and so it's kind of a high flow or low flow situation during the fall. And recently we've been dealing with more droughty type conditions, 23, 24, 25 in the fall. Hopefully we don't deal with that this year, but that remains to be seen, and we got to get out of this one first before we start dealing with the fall. Pam or Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
If you look at the 100-year record, the total number of droughts hasn't changed that much, but the length of time, their droughts are getting longer than they used to be later in the record, with the exception of the last 10 years or so, where we've had these shorter term ones that haven't lasted that long. I keep waiting for the next multi-year one to happen. We had it in 1998 to 2002, 2007 to 9, and 2011 to 13. So sooner or later, we're going to go through another period of a multi-year drought, and that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, I think we all have our fingers crossed that this isn't the one. That's our next, kickoff for the next long-term drought.
Yep.
But I think that's it. Thank you everyone again for jumping on, and we look forward to seeing you all next month. Take care and stay warm, at least for the next couple of days, and then we'll see how things go. So take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye.